I hope you've all had a wonderful lunch. Thanks for making it back this afternoon. I'm really delighted to introduce you to our invited speaker this afternoon, a Professor of Psychology at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, received his PhD from University of Maryland, a prominent and prolific publisher in the field of religion, psychological wellbeing and coping, with well over 200 publications. He's the author of 2 books, The Psychology of Religion and Coping and Spirituality Integrated Psychotherapy. He's developed a measure of religious coping called the RCOPE. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, as well as being involved in 2 divisions related to religious issues and community psychology, and he's received numerous awards and honourable mentions for his highly influential work. So really, we're very fortunate to have our next speaker here today. I'm pleased that Ken is here with us and is able to talk to us about sacred moments and their role in creating resilience and change. So please extend a warm welcome to Professor Ken Pargament.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk with you about one of my most recent areas of interest that I find very compelling, not only intellectually, but emotionally. And I hope some of this material may touch you as I think it's touched other people. And if it does, then it'll really speak to the power of sacred moments, because this is probably not the ideal room to create sacred moments. I'm going to be talking about sacred moments within the context of intimate relationships. And, you know, I'm not sure this can do it, but I suspect, as you'll see, that what we're going to be talking about here are so powerful, they seem to transcend contexts. So I hope you find that to be the case. These are the words of, that come from A. Milne's classic book, Winnie the Pooh. And he says, "Good morning, if it's a good morning, which I rather doubt." This is the rather bleak way that Eeyore greets Winnie the Pooh. Now, Eeyore is a sad ass. It's not a vulgarity. He is literally a sad ass. He's a forlorn donkey. He's the epitome of gloominess, though I find him to be a sweet but gloomy donkey. Now, I shared this with my kids, and they said, "Dad, you need a more up-to-date example. Winnie the Pooh's kind of old." And so I said, "Well, what's a modern example?" Grumpy Cat. This was new to me. But this is the modern day Eeyore. Grumpy Cat's feline face is frozen into a mask of perpetual misery. One of the memes beneath Grumpy Cat's picture reads, "Of all the 9 lives I've lived, this is the worst." Now, I've mused now about whether Eeyore or Grumpy Cat were, at some earlier point in their careers, mental health professionals. Now, don't get me wrong. We have a wonderful field here. We're tremendously fortunate, those of us in the caring professions, to be able to touch the lives of people who come to us, who really have the courage to come to us, revealing their deepest pain, their greatest dreams, in the hopes that somehow we can help transform their lives. And as Frank Riesman pointed out many years ago, and others have elaborated since, it's true that in the process of caring for others, in the process of helping others, we too are helped. We learn from the people we touch. We grow from our understandings derived from other people. We develop our own sense of efficacy, and we derive tremendous meaning and gratification from our work. I know I have. I felt like I've gained a lot more from the people who've come to me than I think I've been able to give them. But this is a difficult field. Any helping profession is tough. It's not easy being a provider. Here's a recent study that I find illustrates the point well. This was a study of Holocaust survivors who were talking to their experiences to people who were willing to listen. Now, what was special in this study is that both the Holocaust survivors and the listeners were hooked up to machines to monitor levels of stress, heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. Now, as a result of telling their stories, the Holocaust survivors experienced a decline in their levels of stress and arousal. It's the confession effect, or the catharsis effect. They were clearly physiologically helped by sharing their stories. As a result of listening to the survivors' stories, though, the listeners experienced an increase in their level of physiological distress. In some ways, they appeared to be taking on the burden of the stories of the survivors. And those of you who can resonate to this, if you've listened to other people share their stories of trauma, it seems like they're relieved, and as you listen, you take it on. And I've had clients myself where after I've heard them share their stories of terrible trauma, I leave the session feeling sick to my stomach, feeling like I need to get some air, even though I know it's been a tremendous value to the clients. Well, we do this on a daily basis. How do we handle it? How do we sustain ourselves? Well, the fact of the matter is, it looks like not all of us do. As a group, we suffer from signs of burnout. And these are the traditional signs of burnout: fatigue, irritability, cynicism, apathy, and so on. I remember coming across an example of it at my very first colloquium at a university. And my guide was a guy, he was 32 years old, a faculty member. And I was sharing with him my interest in the research and my enthusiasm. And his response was, "So how many years do you have to retire?" Now, I was, I think, 27. I said, "Geez, I don't know." He said, "Well, I can tell you how many years I have to retirement." I said, "How do you know that?" We went back to his office, and on his office door was a calendar with the months and days from his age of 32 to 65, all in very small calendar where he was checking each one off. The guy was 32. He had a ways to go. He was burnt out at 32, and I just remember feeling so dispirited coming back from that, thinking, how sad. Here he is, I can't imagine a better job. There's no excuse for being bored in academics. If you don't like what you do something else. You have such choice and power. Well, this isn't a unique example. Many people feel burnt out. In a recent study of physicians, about 46% reported some symptoms of burnout. And even more alarming, the statistics show that physicians have twice the risk of suicide than the general population. I came across this quote: "Each year it would take the equivalent of 1 to 2 average-sized graduating classes of medical school to replace the number of physicians who kill themselves. Among young physicians, suicide is the leading cause of death. Suicide is a leading cause of death among young physicians." Now, a number of researchers and educators have tried to identify factors that reduce the risks of being a care provider. And we've identified a number of buffers, things like social support, coping skills, living a balanced life, exercise, humor, meditation more recently. I'm a big fan of humor. I remember working with some nurses in a pediatric burn unit several years ago. And again, they taught me a lot more than I taught them. They were working with these kids in really tough situations, day in and day out. And I asked them towards the end of my workshop with them, how do you sustain yourself? And these were Sisters of Mercy, nurses, Sisters of Mercy. I said, one sister, she said, "Well, I'll tell you something I did the other day. It was around Christmas time." She said, "I give my kids Christmas cards every year." I said, "Well, that's very nice." Thinking, okay, sounds good. She said, "Well, let me tell you about the card." She says, "On the front is a drawing of a snowman. And inside, you open it up, and there are cotton balls. And the kids ask, 'Sister, what's this?' And she says, 'Oh, those are snowman poops.'" I find it kind of funny. It doesn't seem to have the same response here, but. So we've been particularly interested in the spiritual dimension, and whether spirituality may be a resource not only to those we help, but to us as providers to sustain ourselves. We've done several different kinds of studies. Just to give you an example of one study we did, where we looked at the degree to which people perceive their work as sacred, as not just a job, but a calling or a vocation. In other words, the degree to which they imbue work with deeper sacred qualities. And it can be understood in a theistic sense. So these are some theistic sanctification items of work. So God is present in my work. I experience God through my job. Those kinds of items. We also have non-theistic items that just speak about the degree to which you see your job as a calling or a vocation rather than simply a job. And they're actually, in the general population, these items are highly correlated with each other. We don't even have to distinguish them. And what we found in our research is that these kinds of indicators are tied to greater job satisfaction, greater job commitment, less intention to quit. Well, today I want to talk about another potentially key facilitator of our own well-being. And I'm going to focus on the character of the healing relationship itself. And I know this may sound a little bit weird and woo-woo, but I think by the end you'll see that this really does become very real and down to earth. I'm going to move ahead here from some of these so we have time to get to some of the examples I want to share. And the thesis is that we too are healed by the spiritual character of the helping relationship. We're healed ourselves by the process of helping others, that there's special power in this relationship. It's not a totally new idea. And let me introduce it by talking a little bit about, oops, looks like, let me see here. It's not a totally new idea. Evaluative studies of psychotherapy show something very interesting. When you pit one type of therapy against another, and NIH has supported many of these comparative studies, CBT versus ACT versus RET. If you're doing any kind of therapy, it has to be a 3-letter acronym therapy. 4-letter acronym therapies just won't do it. When we compare these therapies with each other, we find that, yeah, that we can find some differences, but generally they account for relatively small proportions of variance in treatment outcomes, about 1%. So NIH is supporting lots and lots of research to explain about 1% of the variance in treatment outcomes. And this finding has been called the dodo bird effect, after Lewis Carroll, who wrote in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that everybody is one and all must have prizes. If the effects of treatment can't be explained by differences in types of therapy, then what accounts for change? And the answer seems to be largely the relationship between client and therapist. It looks like about 50% of the variance in outcomes can be attributed to something about the therapeutic alliance. In other words, if you have a trusting, caring, genuine relationship with your provider, that seems to account for the lion's share of change. To take it another way, if you have a trusting, caring relationship with a provider, it doesn't seem as important whether your provider's CBT, RET, ACT. Flip it around, and if you have a mistrusting relationship with your provider, then it also doesn't matter what orientation your provider is. You will not be helped if these findings seem to be accurate. So what goes into this caring relationship? Well, we know things about being honest and caring and empathic and trusting. But I'm going to suggest there's a spiritual dimension to this relationship as well. Again, not a totally new idea. In a recent paper by O'Grady, she writes that I feel there's a mystical quality to the therapeutic process, a third force. A client, a therapist, and something else present. It's almost palpable when what appears to be all of a sudden, the client gets it, the aha experience. It's important it's important to pay attention to all the subtleties. She's suggesting there's something else at work in therapy. Psychiatrist Daniel Stern talks about kairos as moments of opportunity in helping people when these are propitious moments when events demand action. He says when the star has reached its apogee and appears to change direction from ascending to descending, they're kind of like tipping points when all kinds of things can happen. We could also talk about peak moments, Maslowian thinking, or talking about moments of flow. Philosopher Martin Buber talked about I-thou relationships that can be experienced as probably the closest we can come to God. Because in the I-thou relationship, Martin Buber suggested, we really touch each other's souls. And our reaching out is also responded to. There is a response directly from the other person. So he distinguishes I-thou relationships where we seem to see into each other's core being versus I-it relationships where we tend to treat each other as objects, people we manipulate or use for our ends. And Buber he says there's plenty of room for I-it relationships too. If you need a surgeon, you want someone who's really good with your it. It'd be nice to have a surgeon who's also good with your thou, but you want to have someone who's really very familiar with your body as an object and skilled with that. Well, drawing on this literature and our own clinical experiences, we've begun to study what we call sacred moments. And all of this I've presented so far is the lead-in to sacred moments. Let me give you an example of a sacred moment. They're all around. I have a colleague in Toledo. His name is Blair Grubb. He's a cardiologist, actually a renowned cardiologist, well known for his work on syncope. And he told the story of a patient, Jenny, in her late 40s, suffering from severe heart failure. And she was beginning to lose kidney and liver function. She'd come to Blair's hospital to see if she'd qualify for a heart transplant. And at the hospital, she suffered 3 cardiac arrests. Jenny was a former nurse and a school teacher, a widow with 2 grown children. She loved to read poetry, and in particular, the work of Dylan Thomas. After a lot of testing, the transplant team told Blair that Jenny was not a suitable candidate for a transplant. Blair broke the news to Jenny as gently as he could. And Jenny said, "I figured as much. I know all of you have worked so hard." She took out a small package and gave it to Blair, noting that the nurses had said that he really likes pens. Blair opened the package and found a blue lacquer Targa fountain pen, and he expressed his deep thanks. Jenny then looked at him straight in the eye and said, "I ask not to be resuscitated if I arrest again. It's been enough fighting, it's my time, and I choose to go gentle into that dark night." Dylan Thomas had written about not going gentle, about raging against the dying of the light. Blair said, "Of course," and with his new Targa pen, he wrote in her chart, "Do not resuscitate." She died less than an hour later. Now Blair writes, "To this day," he says, its presence, to this day I use the pen. Its presence is a reminder of those bonds that link each of us together, that life is both beautiful and mysterious in ways that are sometimes beyond comprehension, and that even in death there can be nobility. There are times when it's better to go gentle into that dark night and quietly bid farewell to the fading light. This is a sacred experience and a sacred moment. What goes into it? For one thing, it's transcendent. Moments like these are set apart. They're set apart from our usual experience, even though they can take place in everyday experience. Blair's experience was something set apart. I've spoken to him. He says, this experience is something extraordinary. Oops. It also has ultimacy to it. It speaks to something that we feel to be ultimately true, something that's really real. It cuts beneath the surface of superficiality. Something about the experience says something about the ultimate nature of our existence. Blair's experience taught him that there can be nobility even in death. It's boundless. It's experience that's set apart from ordinary space and time. It's boundless in its impact. Blair's experience continues to touch him. He says he thinks he's going to remember this till the day he dies. It's the experience that seems to have no boundaries. It involves a deep connection. It involves a sense that we're truly connected to each other, that we see and know each other as we really, really are. Blair's experience said he's been reminded of the bonds that link all of us as human beings. And it elicits powerful spiritual emotions: gratitude, awe, uplift, peace, mystery, humility. Blair's description is filled with the language of positive psychology, positive, powerful emotions. And finally, it can be transformational, life-changing. These experiences are life-changing. William Miller wrote a book several years ago with C.D. Bacher called Quantum Change. It's a wonderful, small book. And he described these life-changing experiences of ordinary people. And he had them, in addition to just capturing their story so beautifully, he had them describe their values before and after their quantum change. Now, many of the quantum change experiences written, I think, qualify as sacred moments. But what he demonstrates through this is just people experience profound change in values and purpose in their lives before and after these sacred moments. For men, initially, their top 5 values were wealth, adventure, achievement, pleasure, respect, manly values. After the quantum change, these are their top 5 values: spirituality, personal peace, family, God's will, honesty. You hear the different tone to this? I could do a George Carlin thing about the values before and after. Very different tone. For women, before the change, family, independence, career, fitting in, and attractiveness. After the quantum change, growth, self-esteem, spirituality, happiness, and generosity. These are some of the profound changes that people experienced. Sacred moments, even if they're brief, can be periods in time that shift your whole orientation to life. Now, you could say things like Blair's experience is pretty infrequent, relatively rare, but we're starting to show that that's not the case. And that if you start looking for sacred moments, you can start to see signs of them wherever you go. I've never done this before, but I'm going to use my cell phone right now. I'm not going to call anybody up and ask them to share a sacred moment, don't worry. But I just got an email from a really good friend of mine. She's a cellist, and she's in Taiwan right now. And she's a wonderful cellist. She plays for the Toledo Symphony. And she was describing her experience going to a classical concert in Taiwan. And I want you to listen to the language, and listen to the language for the words that we're just talking about. And it's just an email that I got at 11:17 a.m., so it's right off my email. She says, and this is what she's experiencing at the concert: "I remember a concert that I went to when I was a child. Tonight, I looked over to those seats. I still remember where I sat. I remember my friend's name and her face. I gave her a nickname, Haza. She had dark, large ponytail. A sense of sentiment came over me. My eyes were filled with tears. I don't know why. It just felt as if time froze. Everything was as vivid as yesterday. Time dissipated to vapor, to nothing. It gave me time to reflect on such a different perspective." She's now listening to a piece of music by Edward Elgar. "I find myself feeling so emotional that my eyes are already wet. When I left the concert hall, I love that piece so dearly. I feel so grateful and blessed to be a musician and to be so intimately part of the making one of the most beautiful creations there is. It felt as if I just stepped into a dreamland. I still can't put it together. There are so many different time and place segments that were placed simultaneously in a moment. Sacred moment that she's having just listening to a piece of music. Let me give you another couple of examples, and I want to talk a little bit about some research we're doing. Several years ago, I was working with a woman, I'll call her Angela, who had been infected with HIV from her partner. Angela's partner then proceeded to abandon her, and her friends distanced themselves from her as well. These were the early days of HIV, where there's a lot of stigma and misunderstanding. Her parents had died recently as well. One day, Angela came into my office distraught. The mother of her much-beloved goddaughter had told Angela that she thought it best for Angela not to see her goddaughter anymore. She feared Angela would infect her goddaughter with AIDS. Now, Angela sat in my office just immobilized by pain. She spoke of how contaminated she felt. She spoke of how cut off she felt from other people. She said that no one had touched her now, even given her a pat on the back for 2 years. She hadn't been physically touched for 2 years. She was, she said, no longer a part of humanity. Now, I'm not a big fan of physical touch in therapy. There's just too much room for misinterpretation. But every role deserves an exception, and this is one. So Angela, I said, would you let me hold your hand? And she nodded her head. So I just held her hand while she cried for the rest of the session, speaking of her profound isolation while I held her hand. I think that was one of the most significant moments in our work together. She recalled it. I still remember it. I can still feel her hand in my hand. That sacred moment, I think, was what helped facilitate her transformation. She had another, more recently, very bleak experience in her life when she was hospitalized for AIDS-related illnesses. And at that time, she was also feeling terribly isolated. People weren't visiting her, and she was missing her parents who had died years earlier terribly. Well, I would go to the hospital and just visit her and sit with her. And one day I came in, and she just looked a lot better, like somehow more relieved, lighter. And I said, "You're looking better." And she said, "Well, I haven't told anybody this, but let me share this with you." She said, "Last night I was lying in bed, and it was late at night, and I was between being awake and asleep, and then my parents came into the room, and they stood by my bed. And my mother held my hand, and my father said, 'I'll be here with you.' And she said, 'I realize my parents still are here, at least in spirit.' And she was lighter, and I've worked with her since. And it's another sacred moment, transformational moment, that has really changed her whole attitude and sense of being. Okay, well, I'm going to shift subject here and talk a little bit then about research. Because we have some hypotheses here that sacred moments are not all that unusual. And they're not unusual in the context of helping relationships. We hypothesize that a group of providers, helping providers, would also experience sacred moments with their clients or patients. And that these sacred moments would be really important for the outcomes to clients, the provider, and the counseling or relationship, as reported by the provider. In other words, that these sacred moments may be sources of resilience, sources of strength and meaning, not just for clients, but for providers. In answer to that question, well, what can sustain us as we try to help other people? I think the answer I'm suggesting may be, well, maybe we're also sustained by the deeper qualities of healing relationships. So we put that to test with a sample of 58 mental health providers. And it was a tough test because these are largely psychiatrists, largely secular, not particularly high on measures of belief in God. And so I was concerned they'd look at the survey and just ditch the whole thing because it would just seem too strange or weird to them. But they completed the survey. And we found that we asked them to select the most important moment they'd had with their client in the last year, and they responded to that most important moment. 46% said the moment felt set apart from everyday life. They imbued the moment with transcendent qualities, extraordinary. 65% said they felt that this moment they were part of something really real. It cut through artifice. It cut through superficiality. It revealed something of fundamental truth. And as I said before, psychologists, we don't usually talk about truth. The T word doesn't cross our lips very well because we can't measure truth. But we certainly can measure perceptions of truth. And here providers are feeling as if they're in touch with something ontologically real, ontologically true. They experienced it. Only a small percentage felt that time had stopped, but others reported that they also felt experiences of boundlessness, deep senses of connectedness with their patient in these moments, and many reported emotions of gratitude, humility, feeling uplifted. Now, what were the implications of these experiences for various outcomes? I'm going to skip that. Reports of sacred moments were tied to strong perceptions of gains in patience. Correlation of 0.63. Remember the importance of the relationship with the patient to outcome. Feeling sacred moments is tied to stronger relationship with patient, at least perceived by providers. Reports of personal growth and transformation. The sacred moments are not only healing for patients, according to these providers, but their own growth. And these are not small effects. I double-checked the correlations because I thought, this can't be right. These are really strong, strong effects. Reports of greater meaning in work and a greater sense of spiritual well-being. Interestingly, they weren't tied to lower burnout, though, and we're taking a look at that right now. But overall, the findings were quite robust. More recently, we replicated these findings with a sample of patients, asking them to do the exact same thing, pick an important moment in therapy with your provider, and the findings were very similar. And I want to highlight that they pointed to stronger working alliance with the provider. Again, that's really key to transformation in therapy. And some reviewers of our initial work had said, well, maybe what you're really getting at through this work is psychoticism in patients or providers, that people who report sacred moments, maybe they're just loose, cognitively on edge. So we added a psychoticism scale and found there was no relationship with psychoticism. So what do we conclude? Well, we conclude that sacred moments are not uncommon. They're part of healing relationships and may be vital not only to clients but ourselves. This recently appeared, this paper in Spirituality in Clinical Practice, an APA journal. And from this then, I think the key question we're interested in right now is how do we cultivate sacred moments? I don't think of it in terms of creating them, because that seems a little bit arrogant that we can create these moments. I think they're something to cultivate, like the soil for something to grow in. Certainly, we know how not to have a sacred moment. How do we not have a sacred moment? Well, never look at your client. I'm struck in medicine how often I see physicians now who are stuck to their computers when you come in. They've got tremendous burden to fill out paperwork, but we recently saw a physician who didn't turn around to see us directly till 5 minutes after we were introduced. He was just typing away. That doesn't facilitate a sacred moment. It may be efficient, but it won't facilitate a sacred moment. Treat your client as an object. At all costs, keep your distance from your client. That'll also ensure that you won't have a sacred moment with someone. And above all, create a sacred moments manual. You have to do that if you never want to have a sacred moment. Here's an example of what not to do, how not to respond. One therapist, in response to a mother who reported a visitation by the spirit of her dead child, said to the woman, the mother, well, you've healed enough. You don't need that anymore. The kind of dismissal, derogation of a sacred experience. That's what not to do. What should we do? Be interested and humble. Respond with interest. If you hear someone share a sacred moment with you or some powerful spiritual experience, respond with interest and curiosity. Tell me more. I'd love to hear more about that. Share your own humanness. Share something of your own humanity. Be open to the possibility that any moment can be a sacred moment, being alert to these powerful emotions that can be part of it. And respond with affirmation. There's a wonderful example of an affirmative response that recently appeared in the American Journal of Psychiatry by James Lomax. He's an eminent psychiatrist at Baylor's Medical Center. And he was working with a patient, a cardiologist, who was dealing with major depression. And at one point in treatment, the patient described an unusual experience that had occurred while she was on vacation in Alaska. She was dog sledding on a glacier, and she knew that her beloved mentor back in Pennsylvania was dying of cancer at the time. She had the sensation that her mentor was standing next to her, and she heard his voice in her head saying, "I've died, but I loved you. I'll always love you, and you will do well." Later, she found out that her mentor had indeed died when she was out on the glacier. A few days later, she and her fiancé were hiking on Mount McKinley, which was covered in, or Mount Denali, which was covered in clouds. And she was feeling very disoriented by this whole thing. She's a secular cardiologist, but here she had this very powerful spiritual encounter. So she's hiking on Mount McKinley, Mount Denali, and she stood there and he asked her mentor, now deceased, to move the clouds off the mountain as a sign that he was all right. It's pretty rare for it to be totally cloud-free there. 2 hours later, the clouds cleared for 3 days. Again, quite unusual in Alaska. Now she's sharing this with incredulity and embarrassment, some shame that she's even reporting on this, crying about it, to Dr. Lomax, her psychiatrist. Now, I want you to listen to Dr. Lomax's response. She says, "I've never told anyone about this until now. Those moments on the glacier and after will always be special to me." He says, "They should be. It's a beautiful love story." She says, "It's also surprising to me. Does this kind of thing routinely happen?" He says, "The sort of love that you had with your mentor is hardly routine." She says, "But do other people have experiences like this with people who've died?" He says, "Only if they're extremely lucky." That's affirmation. That's affirmation of a deeper dimension of life. So I don't think sacred moments can be created or manualized. I think the better metaphor is cultivating them, creating the context or the fertile soil in your relationship so sacred moments can kind of unfold, creating opportunities for sacred moments. And there are all kinds of ways to do that. I want to share a video clip that I came across a while back that illustrates, I think, an imaginative way to cultivate a sacred moment. Now, this occurred in the context of a hospital, Hadassah Hospital in Israel. And I'm not sure if those who put this together were thinking the language of sacred moments, but I'm going to show you this flash mob. And as I show it to you, I want you to look at the faces of the people who are walking through the hospital waiting room. Just look at the faces of the people who are responding to what is being cultivated in Hadassah Hospital. I hope this works. Isn't that remarkable? It's such a juxtaposition. Here you are walking through the waiting room in a hospital filled with worry, anxiety, concern. You can see all the stress and pain on the people's faces. And out of nowhere comes some classical musicians playing Tchaikovsky. And look at the faces, like surprise, delight, awe, some joy, amazement, and people just kind of light up, including people who are wheelchair-bound. People start to dance in a hospital waiting area. I mean, it's amazing. And you know how long that, I think, memorable experience took to transform people's emotional experience? It's 5 minutes. That was a 5-minute episode. Sacred moments don't have to take a long time. They can be very brief, and yet they can be life-transforming. In psychology, we talk about change is hard, you have to discipline yourself, you have to work at it repeatedly, and I think that's largely true. But there's also the possibility of these sacred moments that are moments, fulcrums in time, where you catch people and you can just create amazing, I think, potentially powerful change over the long term, quantum change. I think of sacred moments sometimes as the un-PTSD moments. They're in some ways parallel to PTSD in another parallel universe. PTSD creates searing memories that never go away fully. They're seared into the brain. We know they produce brain changes, and they can stay with us for the rest of our lives, but they're filled with terrible pain, distress, all kinds of physiological symptomatology. Sacred moments are un-PTSD moments. They also are seared into our minds. When you think about what makes your life worthwhile, if you're like me, you probably think about sacred moments. You think about this collection of experiences that you've accumulated over your lives that make life the most meaningful and worthwhile. Sacred experiences, sacred encounters. And I do believe they help balance our lives out and maybe tip it to the side of life being overall a good thing to have, because sacred moments are possible even in the midst of your most terrible suffering. There's always the possibility of a sacred moment. That's why we should always keep going, because you never know when you can encounter a sacred moment. It can occur anytime, any place. You know, my interest in this came in part, I was doing some work down at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, and I was interested in their palliative care unit, and in particular, how do people in palliative care, the providers, sustain themselves in working with people on a daily basis facing death and dying? And I followed them around. And I initially did initial interviews, and I would say things to the staff, so how do you sustain yourself in this work? And they would say things to me like, I'm just so fortunate. And I'd go, okay, yeah, right. But to me, it was platitudes, like I'm blessed. Well, okay, yeah, I hear I'm blessed a lot. And to me, it's kind of like a buzzword for, I want you to know I'm Christian. Are you Christian? It's got that kind of suggestion to it. So I followed palliative care providers around, and it had really incredible learning for me. It was kind of a sacred moment for me to watch what was happening, because what I witnessed was regular sacred moments that were being created in the palliative care ward. For instance, one hospital chaplain was walking on the unit, and I was trailing him, and a father comes up to him. His wife is 26 years old, 3 children, and she's dying. And the father says to the chaplain, "I don't know how to tell my children that their mother is dying," in the hallway. And the chaplain says, "Well, let's go over here and talk." And he goes to a secluded area, opens up, they have these 3-pronged cane chairs so that they can have a conversation wherever they go. They just pop open the cane and it becomes a chair. And he's talking to the father, and in 5 minutes is giving him a variety of practical suggestions about talking to kids about death and just empathizing with him and being a caring presence. The father is crying and shaking, and the chaplain is just there with him. And they're connecting at such a powerful level. And afterwards, I said to him, "Is this one of the reasons why you're able to say you feel so grateful in this work?" And he said, "Exactly." If I turn it into researchese, I'd say, he's sustained in his work. He feels blessed, and it's legitimate. He feels incredibly grateful because he has a regular dosage of sacred moments. More than the rest of us, people in palliative care, if they're receptive to them, are regularly exposed to the most profound experiences, sacredly powerful experiences that transform their own lives. And I just had a little dose of it myself, but if I'm in that position, I want to go to that hospital. And it's certainly taken some of my fear of dying away to realize that there are people like that who can be so incredibly caring. Well, I want to wrap this up because I want to just make sure there's time for at least a couple of questions. I'm skipping over a few things here. Okay. How do we cultivate sacred moments? I think by recognizing that we're spiritual as well as psychological social beings, and by injecting more of our human spirit and lending greater humanity to our role in relationships with people that we care for. And by healing others, I think it's true that we become better at healing ourselves and being healed. So in our work, we can often detect the voice of Eeyore, that unfortunate academic who's counting out the days of retirement at the age of 32. The voice of gloom, defeatism, despair, and hopelessness, the voice of Eeyore or Grumpy Cat, can be heard not only from clients, but from within ourselves. Call it our inner Eeyores. But we need to be attuned to that voice, wherever it comes from. And as we engage in our healing conversations with Eeyore, spirituality offers a potentially crucial resource, not only to Eeyore, but to us, an anchor that helps us keep our feet rooted on solid, hopeful ground. Our conversations with Eeyore can be terribly trying and depleting, but we have to persist, for there's one thing we can never allow. We can never let Eeyore have the last word. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions or comments or even sharing of a sacred moment. And usually when I have more time, I have people share their sacred moments, which can be incredibly powerful. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. So a lot of sacred moments can become sort of esoteric and can be on the border of very strange experience. So how do you draw the line between normal and positive and being kind of psychopathic?
Okay, how do we draw the line between normal and psychopathic? Most of the experiences, the large majority of experiences are in fact quite part and parcel of being human. So I think the issue is more us than other people. There's a small portion of people who will have psychotic experiences that can overlap with sacred experiences. But I just encourage people to kind of relax about it a little bit. That the vast majority of experiences, including hearing voices of deceased spirits, That's not typically a sign of psychoticism. In fact, the majority of people do report, who've lost a loved one, will report some sense of contact with departed people. That's normative, at least in this culture. It's not unusual. It's not a sign of pathology. And in fact, having a sense of support from people who've died seems to be quite helpful to people and seems to help people through the grieving process. Yeah, there are ways to discriminate between sacred moments and psychotic experience. And that would take a paper in itself or a list of criteria. But in this talk, I'm trying to really normalize this whole thing, and not just normalize it. I'm speaking to a group of positive psychologists. This is a positive dimension. This is the un-PTSD dimension. There's power in these experiences. We should cultivate them. We should cultivate them, encourage conversations about them, learn more about them, and try to cultivate them in the context of our own healing relationships, because we can create sacred moments in our relationships with other people, not just our clients. We're doing a study right now on sacred moments of adult children caring for parents, particularly parents in cognitive decline. And children and their parents can have sacred moments even when the parents have declined to the point where they may think that there's no longer any recognition of their children, and yet there are these amazing experiences that seem to almost defy physiological possibility. Those are sacred moments that help sustain providers, the children themselves, through this awful position of adult caregiving. Yes. Other thoughts, other comments about this? Yes? Yes. Okay. Why don't you come on up afterwards, and I can give you the list when you go over the slide. Okay. Yeah. Other. Yes. Thank you.
So from the examples you gave, it was mostly in a setting, like a hospital setting or care providing setting. And I was wondering, so it seems like sacred moments arise from times when beauty or positivity arise from pain or sadness. And I was wondering if you think that these negative feelings are actually playing an important role in allowing a sacred moment to arise. Like, is it important for sacred moments?
Actually, in the study we did on providers, we did find that sacred moments were more likely to come out of sessions that there was particular pain in them. So they may be in part responses to tension and conflict, and they have a kind of surprising quality to them, and it was a response to maybe fundamental pain, suffering, and struggle. And they seem to offer a kind of resolution to that for some people. I don't think they're always, though, a response to that. Sometimes sacred moments just seem to come out of nowhere. Go to the Grand Canyon, have a sacred moment, or just go to a concert, and you can be in a good mood, and you still go to the concert, and you hear remarkable music, and all of a sudden you're transported. Yes?
I just think that sacred moments kind of get better with time. I don't know why I have the theory that maybe symbols or things that remember us from sacred moments actually can potentialize the sacred moment itself. And when we revive it by watching the symbol, we actually make it a little bit more intense.
Yes. I think that could really be true. It seems to me that one of the things we can do in our culture is do a better job of helping people name and reflect on and put sacred moments into a place. For a lot of people, I think people have sacred moments more often than they recognize, but they may not have a place to put it. They don't know how to label it. And so it's lost. It's just instead becomes, wow, something weird to me happened today, And that's all it was a momentary weirdness. And a potentially transformational moment in life is lost because we haven't helped people give it a language and to be able to cultivate it and use it in their lives. Well, what does that say about your life? What does it say about where you may be heading in your life? Yes?
And I'm going to piggyback off that too. I had the opportunity after 9/11 to work with some of the survivors in a financial service company. And they were telling their stories. They were very negative stories. And one woman had the courage to say, I had a different experience. And she shared this transformative sacred moment And all of a sudden, there was a ripple through the group, and other people started telling their stories with the first sentence of, "I was afraid to say this because it was such
Yeah.
a bad experience." So do you find that?
Yes, I've done workshops on this, and one of the most powerful things is to just create small groups of people, 4 or 5 people, and they're strangers, because I don't want people who know each other. Strangers share a sacred moment. Now, usually in psychology, we have to be careful to define the sacred moment in this. No, I just say, I want you to share a sacred moment with each other. That's it. That's the instruction, nothing more. I've never had anyone ask me to define it. They know there's something about it, but the act of talking about it creates almost a secondary sacred moment. When you hear sacredness from somebody else, you resonate at this deeper level, and you can respond with your own sacred story, which then elicits more this sense of we're in a transcendent place, we're talking about things that are really real, there are powerful spiritual emotions going on here, we feel deeply interconnected with each other. And, I do workshops that can last quite a while, and you know what people remember from the workshops, because I do evaluations afterwards? 90% of the evaluative feedback is about the sacred moment and how they'll always carry that with them. Just talking about it creates sacred moments. There's such power in these experiences. And here we are in this huge theater or auditorium, and I hope you're getting the sense, too, this is really powerful material. It works best when we're more intimate with each other, but it's just powerful, and it's just a dimension that's been neglected. I feel like it's kind of like, again, a vital ingredient or a DNA element of growth that we just haven't really looked at very well yet. And yet, there's power. Where there's emotion, there's power, and this is really emotionally powerful. So, okay, well, we're past our time. Thank you very much.